2023 seems to be Turkey's fateful year, and it could not have started more tragically. The earthquakes at the beginning of February are feared to have killed up to 50,000 people in eastern Turkey. More than 24 million people are affected by the scale of destruction, and there is looting, increasing violence, and fears of epidemics spreading in the affected areas. The whole country is in shock. Many observers are now asking themselves, what impact will this have on Turkey's upcoming elections this year, in this momentous year, which also marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic. Of course, one figure immediately comes to mind, the founding father of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Without him, Turkey, in its geography, politics, and mentality as we know it today, would probably not exist. The birth of Turkey as a sovereign, independent state is indeed nothing less than a miracle. The fact that from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, from this highly compressed phase of war and violence, from 1912 to 1922, a stable national state that was recognized by the world was able to emerge and did not immediately employ it again, is largely due to this one person. Just like the history of Turkey itself, Ataturk's life is a story of both heroism and tragedy. Before Ataturk became Ataturk, he was simply Mustafa, born in poor circumstances in 1881 in cosmopolitan Salonika, in what is now Thessaloniki. His exact date of birth is not known. He himself later chose the 19th May, a significant date for him and for the entire country of Turkey, which in 1919 was to mark the beginning of the country's liberation from the victorious powers and invaders of the First World War. His self-will and dominant character became apparent early on. He dropped out of school several times because he disagreed with his teachers, and contrary to his mother's wishes, he decided at the age of 12 to pursue a military career. He was drawn to the great city of Istanbul, the capital at the time, where he attended the military academy in 1899 and graduated at the top of his class. One of his teachers gave him the nickname Kemal, which means perfection in Arabic. Mustafa took a liking to it and became Mustafa Kemal without further ado. The Ottoman Empire was known in Europe at this time as the stick man of the Bosphorus because of its internal weaknesses and the outdated sultanate. While the other countries around the multi-ethnic state continued to develop and expand, the Ottoman Empire was not even able to compete and even had to surrender its Romanian territories in the European part. This was because Sultan Abdulhamid II was opposed to modernization modeled on the West. In contrast, the military was a progressive force in the empire, for the Sultan himself brought foreign advisors into the country to develop the military. This was reflected in the young cadet. And so, within the military, young officers, but also outside the arms, young intellectuals came together, united by a secular enlightenment philosophy based on the Western model. Mustafa Kemal was one of them, and soon after his transfer to Salonika, he met another of these groups, the Young Turks. In 1908, it was precisely these Young Turks who demanded the revival of the constitution and parliament that had been suspended 30 years earlier. The Sultan had no choice but to agree, and a year later he too was forced to resign. He was followed, however, by two more sultans, but with far less power. But the idea of completely abolishing the sultanate did not even occur. After all, there had been a sultan in the empire for 600 years, and the imagination did not reach that far. Mustafa Kemal had a tense relationship with the leaders of the Young Turks. Unlike them, he did not want a great Turkish empire, and the sultanate and monarchy were not untouchable for him, and should be replaced by a republican nation-state on the Western model.
The sultanate must be destroyed. Religion and state must be separated from each other. We must turn away from Eastern civilization and turn towards Western civilization. We must abolish the differences between men and women and thus found a new social order. We must abolish the Arabic script, which prevents us from participating in Western civilization. We must develop our own alphabet based on the Latin script, and we must align ourselves with the West in every way, right down to our clothing.
Even the Young Turks could not stop the collapse of the empire, for from 1911 and 1912 followed the most devastating decade for the multi-ethnic state. A decade full of blood, violence, and tears. It ended with the inevitable fall of the empire, but something emerged from its ashes that no one had expected, a modern republic born of war. The First Balkan War was a total military failure on the part of the Ottoman Empire. It lost all of its southern Eastern European possessions and with them a large part of its population. There had to be consequences. The multi-ethnic and multi-confessional empire was dead, and it was decided to concentrate on the Turks alone from now on. The military was radically transformed. The entire military corps was dismissed and replaced by a new generation of officers. Among them, of course, was Mustafa Kemal. He had already demonstrated his military talent in the Italo-Turkish War, but his conflict with the Young Turk government saw him sent off the battlefield to Bulgaria during the Second Balkan War. Here, he met Dimitrina Kovacheva, the daughter of a Bulgarian general, and fell in love. But he was bitterly disappointed, as on the one hand, her father forbade a marriage between the two, and on the other hand, the start of the First World War called him back into the war zone. He would carry the grief of the loss of this love with him all his life. Then, in 1914, the Great World Fire, the outbreak of the First World War. The Ottoman Empire had to choose a side in the war. After the approaches to the Entente powers were unsuccessful, the Ottomans joined the Central Powers in the hope of taking back the land they lost to the Balkan region and in the east of the empire. Germany did not think much of the military strength of its ally, so it sent high-ranking German officers to the empire to command the troops. Among them were Liman von Sanders, head of the German military mission and commander of the Fifth Army defending the Dardanelles, and Erich von Falkenhayn as commander of the Army Group Blitz. Yildirim. Mustafa Kemal was very discontent with the presence of the German officers. On the one hand, he was concerned about their military tactics, but he also feared that the Ottoman Empire could become a German colony if the Central Powers won the war. In fact, this was part of the German plan. Fortunately, as you know, it did not come to happen. There are three decisive moments in Mustafa Kemal's life that made him one of the most amazing military geniuses in history. The Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, the successful retreat from Aleppo and Naples in 1917, and the Battle of Sakarya in Dumlupnar in 1921. Let us first come to the Battle of Gallipoli. In the First World War, the Ottoman Empire's most important task was to prevent the Entente powers from gaining control of the southern straits of the Dardanelles and to decapitate the Ottoman Empire by occupying Istanbul. Mustafa Kemal commanded the 19th Division of the Fifth Army under Liman von Sanders in 1915. He knew the area very well and knew that the Entente would attack from the south, thus contradicting Sanders' plans. Mustafa Kemal was to be proved right, for French, British and Anzac troops landed right here. On Sanders' orders, however, no division was there now, none except for Mustafa Kemal's division. He understood that the fate of the Ottoman Empire was now in his hands. If he gave way, the Anzac troops could reach the way for the occupation of Istanbul and thus the Ottoman Empire in no time. So he had to hold the position with the remaining regiments until reinforcement would arrive, whatever the cost. He spoke the following historic words to his men.
Ben size taarruz emretmiyorum. Ölmeyi emrediyorum. Biz ölünceye kadar geçecek zaman içinde yerimizi başka kuvvetler ve başka komutanlar alabilir.
And indeed, they were able to hold out until the reinforcements arrived, into whose hands Mustafa Kemal placed his life and that of its men. Istanbul and with it the entire Ottoman Empire were saved. The naval battle for Gallipoli became one of the greatest defeats in the First World War for the then responsible Admiralty Minister Winston Churchill himself and the entire Entente. For Mustafa Kemal, the Battle of Gallipoli on land marked the birth of his status as a military hero. Kaiser Wilhelm II awarded him the Iron Cross in honor, and after his renewed action in the Caucasus, he was elevated to the rank of Pasha. In 1917, Mustafa Kemal Pasha was sent to Syria to recapture Baghdad and drive the British out of Palestine together with the army group Blitz under Falkenhayn. Mustafa Kemal strongly criticized Falkenhayn's strategy, saying that the troops would be better sent to Sinai to defend Palestine rather than to fight for Baghdad. But as in Gallipoli, his objection was not heard. As a result of the open criticism, he was summarily cold and dismissed. In 1918, he found himself again in the ranks of Liman von Sanders as commander of the 7th Army in the battle for Palestine. The situation of the Ottoman forces looked bad against the superior British military, which, with the help of T.E. Lawrence, was able to unite large parts of the Middle East behind it. General Allenby executed a strategically perfect battle plan against the outmatched Sanders. What followed is considered one of the greatest defeats in Turkish military history. The Ottoman troops were surrounded and in danger of being crushed. Mustafa Kemal Pasha, as the only Pasha who had not yet fled, quickly realized that disaster was imminent. He now had to pull his men back from the encirclement in a coordinated fashion before the British cut off their route of retreat. Many military heroes are celebrated for their victories, not their defeat. But a successful retreat from an overpowering and mobile enemy is one of the toughest military operations and a feat that few in history have achieved. Mustafa Kemal is one of these few. For many historians, he is considered one of the best generals in military history precisely because of this brilliant retreat. But as you know, the Central Powers lost the First World War. The Ottoman Empire thus suffered heavy territorial losses. The Young Turk leadership, the so-called Triumvirat, quickly fled the country at the end of the war and were never to return. For centuries, three great territorial empires shaped the face of Europe: Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. None of these three empires withstood the turmoil of the First World War. But of all the losers of the war, it was only the Ottoman Empire that was able to defy the regulations imposed by the victorious powers and enforce a peace treaty, at the end of which in 1923 the new Turkey was to stand as a sovereign national state under international law. This was largely thanks to Ataturk. But the way there was connected with another war, the founding war of Turkey, so to speak, the War of Independence. İstiklal Savaşı. How does it come to this? After the surrender in 1918, the armistice of Mudros and the escape of the Young Turks, the power, or rather what was left of it, went back to the Sultan. Mehmed VI, Vahdettin, the very last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, worked closely with the victorious powers of the Entente. Authority in the country was now primarily in the hands of the victorious powers. The Sultan was prepared to make many concessions, such as punishing those responsible for the Armenian genocide. In addition, on the 15th May 1919, Greek troops landed in Smyrna, today Izmir, to militarily enforce the provisions of the surrender Treaty of Sèvres and to establish a great Greek empire. The Ottoman Empire was to be divided and distributed among the victors. The British and French, in particular, found the right of self-determination of peoples too repellent and planned to divide the Ottoman Empire among themselves and force the Turks out of Europe once and for all. The docility of the Sultan, the foreign domination by the victorious powers, and now the military presence of the Greeks, it was too much for the proud Turks. A national movement formed in the unoccupied areas of Anatolia, which did not want to submit to the will of the victorious powers. The Entente powers were worried that this national movement might become too strong, and so they quickly occupied Istanbul, and the parliament was dissolved. The parliamentarians fled to Ankara to join the resistance, where they formed the Great National Assembly, Büyük Millet Meclisi. The parliament was never to return to Istanbul, and Ankara would remain the political center of the country. After Gallipoli and a successful retreat from Palestine, Mustafa Kemal was considered the best commander of the Ottoman Empire and possessed authority. He received an order from the Sultan on behalf of the Entente powers to ensure peace in Anatolia and to demobilize remaining Ottoman troops. The order came just at the right time for Mustafa Kemal. What follows is history, and every Turkish child knows it by heart.
Kafes açılmış, önünde geniş bir alem. Kanatlarını çırparak uçmaya hazırlanan bir kuş gibiydim.
On the 19th May 1919, Mustafa Kemal landed in Samsun on the Black Sea coast. Instead of stopping the uprising as planned, he joins them. This day is now considered the beginning of the War of the Anatolian National Movement, or War of Salvation, Kurtuluş Savaşı, because without it, the Treaty of Sèvres would have come into force. The empire would be divided and reduced to a minimal Anatolian core. Mustafa Kemal has since been dismissed from his post, and a fatwa was even been imposed on him. But this changes nothing. He knows the resistance movement is behind him. He does not give the Treaty of Sèvres a second glance and proclaims the indivisibility of the territory. At the First National Assembly, calls on all Muslims to defend themselves against the separatist movements of the Armenians and Greeks. With a great deal of diplomatic skill, Mustafa Kemal manages to keep the Entente powers out of the war in order to fight only the Greeks. He is supported by the Soviet Union, which appreciates him as an ally against the imperialist West. The Turkish War of Liberation now becomes the Turkish-Greek War. This was to be a Herculean task, for the approximately 95,000 soldiers of the national movement were opposed by 120,000 best-equipped Greeks. In the spring of 1921, the troops of the national movement under the command of Mustafa Kemal were able to stop the Greeks at İnönü for the time being. But after a successful offensive, the Greeks were on the verge of Ankara in the summer. Panic spread. The enemy was so close that the cannons could be heard in the new capital. The decisive battle of Sakarya followed. Mustafa Kemal called on the troops to be patient and to hold their defenses unconditionally against the Greeks. And indeed, the Greeks could not break through the Turkish defense and suffered more and more losses. Mustafa Kemal had been waiting for this moment. Now his troops could go on the offensive. On the 30th August 1922, after more than 10 years of wars in the country, the army was able to mobilize its last forces for a decisive final time and crushed large parts of the Greek army in the Battle of Dumlupinar. On the 9th September 1922, the first Turkish unit marched into Smyrna, which was henceforth to be called Izmir. Against all expectations and against so many enemies, the Turkish patriots were able to assert themselves in these 10 years. so that the way was now actually open for a modern Turkish republic. Mustafa Kemal, who by now was allowed to bear the honorary title of Ghazi for his services, knew that they could not lose any time now. So many other republics around them had been proclaimed after the turmoil of the war, and yet had been absorbed by the great powers shortly afterwards. Thus, the Soviet Union swallowed the Caucasus republics. North Africa was conquered by the colonial powers, and Egypt continued to be controlled by the UK. The Treaty of Sèvres had fortunately become invalid with the War of Independence won, but now a new treaty had to be made. In November 1922, the European national states, plus the USA and Japan, met in Lausanne. Mustafa Kemal sent İsmet İnönü, his trusted advisor and foreign minister. He arrived with maximal territorial claims in his luggage. The War of Independence can be described as a military masterstroke by the Young Turkey. The Treaty of Lausanne was a diplomatic one. They were granted unrestricted sovereignty. Egemenlikheid şartı milletindir. Hardly any country had been able to negotiate this with the victorious powers before. They were one of the few states that managed to free themselves from the instruments of torture of European trade imperialism and to be recognized under international law. It is a miracle that after more than a decade of wars, blood, sweat, and tears, the former multi-ethnic state still had so much willpower to build a republic and defy the great powers. It is precisely from this struggle for survival and the unlikely victory of the national movement that Turkey draws its self-image. It would probably not have happened without one person, that one person who was able to save a country from division with military and diplomatic brilliance, Mustafa Kemal, who would later be called Ataturk, father of the Turks, because of this. Mustafa Kemal was elected president of the state by the National Assembly in October 1923. And was to remain so until his death in 1938. With unparalleled speed and consistency, he now set about laying the groundwork for the newly founded republic. His plan to create a progressive Turkey independent of the West. At the same time, he wanted to follow the path of European science and culture. His philosophy was a kind of anti-Western Westernism, the striving for a modernized society in the spirit of science and culture, but without imperialism. One of his most famous sayings characterizes this belief in the sciences.
Eğer bir gün benim öğretilerim bilimle ters düşerse bilimi seçin.
He now immediately set about modernizing the legal system, state structure, religion, and culture. Mustafa Kemal oriented, indeed copied, the European model. The new civil code is a copy of the Swiss civil code. The new penal code is based on the Italian model and commercial law on the German model. From now on, religious freedom and the prohibition of polygamy ruled. The caliphate was abolished, making Turkey a laicist state. For Ataturk, religion is regressive and has no place in state affairs. With this attitude, however, he did not only make friends. From then on, men and women were equal before the law, and Mustafa Kemal pushed for equality very seriously.
İnsan topluluğu kadın ve erkek denilen iki cins insandan mürekkeptir. Kabil midir ki bu kütlenin bir parçasını ilerletelim, ötekini ihmal edelim de kütlenin bütünlüğü ilerleyebilsin? Mümkün müdür ki bir cismin yarısı toprağa zincirlerle bağlı kaldıkça öteki kısmı göklere yükselebilsin?
Mustafa Kemal set the best example by marrying the educated and emancipated Latife Hanım in an official ceremony in 1923. Latife accompanied Mustafa Kemal unveiled in public and partly wrote his speeches. She represented the modern Turkish woman in the country, but both were probably strong characters, and soon they could no longer stand each other. Mustafa Kemal filed for divorce only 2 years after the marriage. He was never to father any biological children, but he adopted 13 children, including Sabiha Gökçen, who was later to become the world's first female fighter pilot. You can see her video in the following. Mustafa Kemal was never to marry again. He devoted himself to further reforms. In 1935, for example, the surname law came into force, according to which all citizens had to choose a Turkish surname from then on. He himself was exclusively giving the name Ataturk. One of the biggest reforms was the writing reform and then the language reform. From 1928, Ataturk himself traveled the country with a blackboard and chalk and taught Latin script. He was of course not alone in this attempt. He was accompanied by teachers and volunteers in order to improve literacy and education revolution. Mustafa Kemal, as already shown, liked to lead by his own example in the reforms. This was also the case with the language reform. In October 1927, he gave a 63-hour speech. the Nutuk, a kind of autobiography, over 6 days to demonstrate a new language. With all these reforms, Ataturk wanted not only to modernize but also to create a common narrative and founding myth. Ne mutlum Türk'üm diyene. How lucky to be a Turk. Another reform probably sounds unimportant to our ears, but at the time it was a symbolic explosive power. The hat reform. From now on, wearing a European hat in public was mandatory. All other hats, most of which had religious significance, were forbidden under penalty of law. Like many other reforms, this one was also directed against religion and provoked more resistance than the abolition of the caliphate. But Ataturk was not out of touch with the world and knew his people. Despite his aversion to religion, he resisted the temptation to ban the veiling of women by the state, as in Iran or Afghanistan at the same time. In spite of everything, Ataturk took religious feelings into consideration and acknowledged their deep roots in society. Ataturk used his last years to implement the reforms nationwide, but with the onset of the 1930s and the nationalist excesses of many other countries, he also recognized the emerging danger.
In my opinion, the fate of Europe will depend, as it did yesterday, on the attitude of Germany tomorrow. This exceptionally dynamic and disciplined nation of 70 million, as soon as it gives into a political current that wipes up its desires, will sooner or later seek to do away with the Treaty of Versailles. Germany will be able, in a very short time, to raise an army capable of occupying the whole of Europe, with the exception of England and Russia. The war will break out in 40 or 45. France no longer has the possibility of raising a strong army. England can no longer rely on France to defend her island. America will not be able to remain neutral in this war, just as it did in the First World War. And Germany will lose this war because of America's entry into the war.
A shiver runs down my spine when I hear that. Even though Ataturk's home was the military for a long time, he is no friend of war.
Milletin hayatı tehlikeye maruz kalmadıkça savaş bir cinayettir.
He begs his successor İnönü not to let Turkey get dragged into the World War. In doing so, he did Turkey another great service, and İnönü tried his best to bring the Turkish Republic through the war years in one piece. In 1938, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk closed his eyes at 9:05 on the 10th November at the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. As a soldier, Mustafa Kemal fought for his country. As a pasha, he was part of both the greatest military successes and the greatest military defeats. As a Ghazi, he brought independence to his people. As president, he built a strong and modern republic that would endure after him. And as Ataturk, he became a symbol of the heroic and painful history of all Turkey. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in more Turkish or African history, click here.